The studio executive said. Actors don't decide. Clint Eastwood stood up quietly, walked to the door without looking back, and left. What he did in the next 24 hours changed a 40-year legacy. It was 1976. Warner Brothers Studio. Burbank, California. A Thursday afternoon in late September. The kind of day when the California sun came through the Venetian blinds at exactly the wrong angle, making everyone in the boardroom squint and sweat in their suits. Clint Eastwood sat at the far end of the conference table. Dark jacket. Simple shirt. No tie. He'd been sitting there for 45 minutes, listening. 7 studio executives occupied the other chairs. Expensive suits. Loud voices. Important titles. They'd been talking for those same 45 minutes. Talking about budgets. Talking about marketing. Talking about Clint's next film like he wasn't in the room. Clint hadn't said a word. His hands rested on the table. Relaxed. Not clenched. Not fidgeting. Just there. His face carried that expression people had learned to recognize over the years. Not angry, not bored, not anything. Just present. Watching. Listening. The project was a Western. Clint had brought the script to Warner Brothers himself. A story about an aging outlaw trying to leave violence behind, haunted by the men he'd killed, searching for something resembling redemption before it was too late. The studio loved it. Of course they loved it. Clint Eastwood in a Western meant money. But they had notes. They always had notes. The third act needs work, one executive said, flipping through pages he clearly hadn't read carefully. Too slow. We need a bigger shootout. More action. The female character, what's her purpose? Another asked. She needs to be younger. More attractive. Give the audience something to look at. And the ending. A third executive chimed in, leaning back in his leather chair with the confidence of someone who never made anything but decisions about other people's work. He dies? That's not going to play. Heroes don't die. You need to survive. Ride off into the sunset. That's what audiences pay for. Clint sat still, listening. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The head of production. A man named Gerald Mitchum, 52 years old, 3 decades in the business, the kind of executive who'd greenlit 100 films and taken credit for 50 of them, stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the studio lot. At the sound stages. At the kingdom he helped run. Clint, Gerald said, not turning around. You're a hell of an actor. Everyone knows that. But you're not a director. Not really. One film doesn't make you a director. The studio has people for that. We have people who understand story structure, pacing, what audiences want. He turned around. Looked directly at Clint. What I'm saying is, actors don't decide. You bring us the material. We shape it. We make it work. That's how this business functions. That's how it's always functioned. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people thinking. The tense quiet of people waiting to see what happens next. Clint looked at Gerald. Not with anger. Not with hurt. Just looked at him. 3 seconds. 4. 5. Then Clint stood up. No dramatic movement. No chair scraping. He just rose from his seat the way a man stands when he's finished sitting. Slow. Deliberate. Final. He reached behind him and picked up his jacket from where it hung on the chair. Draped it over his arm. Looked at the script on the table, the pages covered in the executive's notes, their suggestions, their improvements to a story they hadn't written. Clint didn't pick up the script. He walked toward the door. Past the executives. Past Gerald Mitchum. Past the table covered in coffee cups and ashtrays and the debris of men who thought talking was the same as doing. His hand touched the door handle. Clint, Gerald said, his voice carrying a warning now. If you walk out of this room without agreeing to these changes, you're walking away from a 3-picture deal. You're walking away from more money than most people see in a lifetime. You need to think about what you're doing. Clint opened the door, stepped through it, and closed it behind him without saying a single word. The executives sat in stunned silence. Gerald Mitchum stood by the window, his face red, his hands clenched. "He'll be back," Gerald said to the room. "They always come back." But Clint Eastwood didn't come back. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened before. Clint Eastwood had been acting in Hollywood since the 1950s. Small roles. Television westerns. B-movies. He'd worked steadily, paid his dues, learned his craft. Then came the Sergio Leone films in Italy, 3 westerns that turned him into an international star. The Man with No Name. Squinting into the desert sun. Saying almost nothing. Doing everything. He came back to America famous. Studios wanted him. They offered him leads. Big budgets. Franchise potential. And Clint took the work. He was a professional. He showed up on time. He knew his lines. He did what was asked. But he watched. He watched directors work. He watched how films were made. He watched how some directors treated actors like props and other directors treated them like collaborators. He watched how some films came together with vision and others fell apart from compromise. In 1971, Clint directed his first film. Play Misty for Me. A thriller. Low budget. He starred in it and directed it. The studio gave him the chance because the budget was small enough that if it failed, the damage would be minimal. It didn't fail. It was good. Critics noticed. Audiences noticed. And Clint learned something important. He could tell stories his own way. With his own rhythm. With respect for the craft and the people doing the work. But Hollywood didn't quite know what to do with an actor who wanted to direct. It was unusual then. Actors acted. Directors directed. Executives decided. That was the order of things. Clint didn't argue with the order. He just worked. He took acting jobs to pay for the freedom to direct. He built relationships. He earned trust. He proved himself quietly, one project at a time, in the way he always did everything, without fanfare, without explanation, just results. By 1976, he'd directed 3 films. All profitable. All respected. He'd proven he understood the medium. He'd proven he could deliver. But the studio system doesn't change just because you've proven yourself. The studio system changes when you force it to change. 24 hours after Clint walked out of that boardroom, Gerald Mitchum's secretary received a phone call. It was Clint's lawyer. "Mr. Eastwood is formally declining the 3-picture deal with Warner Brothers," the lawyer said. "He'll be returning any advance payments within 30 days. Gerald laughed when he heard. "He's posturing. Give him a week. He'll realize nobody else is going to give him director control. He'll come back." 3 days later, Clint Eastwood held a press conference. Not a big one. Just him and a handful of journalists in a small room at the Beverly Hills Hotel. No publicist managing the message. No prepared statement. Just Clint sitting in a chair, answering questions. "Is it true you walked away from Warner Brothers?" one journalist asked. "Yes." "Over creative control?" "Over respect," Clint said quietly. "I'm not asking to make films the studio doesn't believe in. I'm asking to make films the way I believe they should be made. If a studio doesn't want that partnership, then we're not partners. Do you have another deal lined up?" "No." "Are you worried about your career?" Clint looked at the journalist for a moment. That look. The one people had learned not to interpret as anything other than Clint thinking. "I'm 56 years old," he finally said. "I've been acting for 25 years. If my career ends because I walked away from a deal that didn't respect the work, then it ends. But I don't think it will." He was right. Away from the cameras, Clint made a choice no one expected. Within a week, Clint had meetings with 3 other studios. Not asking for deals. Just sitting down. Talking. Explaining his vision. Explaining how he worked. Explaining that he didn't need a massive budget. He needed autonomy. Trust. Partnership. Universal Studios offered him exactly that. Not a 3-picture deal. A 5-picture deal. With director control. With final cut. With approval over casting and crew. Everything Gerald Mitchum had said actors don't get. The first film under that deal would be the Western Clint had brought to Warner Brothers. The aging outlaw story. The one about redemption and regret and the cost of violence. The one the executives wanted to change. Clint didn't change a word. He made the film exactly as he'd written it. He hired a crew he trusted. He treated them with respect. He didn't yell. He didn't throw tantrums. He showed up early. He stayed late. He worked. The female character stayed exactly as written, not younger, not more decorative, but real. Complex. A woman with her own story. The third act stayed slow. Stayed quiet. Stayed true to what the story needed. And the ending stayed the same. The hero died. Not in a blaze of glory. But exhausted. Broken. Forgiven maybe. Redeemed possibly. But dead. The studio executives at Universal watched the rough cut and got nervous. "This isn't what audiences want," one of them said. "This is too dark. Too slow. Too real." Clint sat through the meeting. Listened. Then said 5 words. "Let's show it and see." They screened the film for test audiences. The response was overwhelming. People cried. People sat in silence when the credits rolled. People talked about it for days. The film opened in the spring of 1977. It made back its budget in the first weekend. It went on to become one of the highest-grossing westerns of the decade. Critics called it a masterpiece. Audiences called it honest. And at the Academy Awards that year, when Clint Eastwood stood on stage accepting an award for his work, he didn't thank the studio for believing in him. He thanked his crew. The people who'd shown up every day. The people who'd trusted the vision. The people who'd done the work. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, forever. Gerald Mitchum retired from Warner Brothers 3 years later. In interviews, people would sometimes ask him if he regretted losing Clint Eastwood. "I didn't lose him," Gerald would say. "He just decided he didn't need us." Which was true. Clint Eastwood never worked with Warner Brothers again. Not because he held a grudge. Clint didn't hold grudges. But because the relationship had defined itself in that boardroom. And Clint respected definitions. Over the next 40 years, Clint Eastwood would direct and produce more than 30 films. He would win Academy Awards. He would be called one of the greatest filmmakers of his generation. And people who worked with him, actors, crew members, studio executives, would all tell the same story. That Clint never raised his voice. Never threw tantrums. Never demanded worship. He just worked. With respect. With professionalism. With a quiet understanding that the work mattered more than the ego. In 2018, a young journalist interviewed Clint about his career. About how he'd built such a lasting legacy. About what advice he'd give to young filmmakers trying to find their way in an industry that often doesn't respect them. Clint thought for a moment. Then he said this. "Nobody can make you compromise if you're willing to walk away. Most people aren't willing. They're too afraid. They need the validation. They need the deal. But if you know what you're trying to say, and you believe it's worth saying, then you don't need anyone's permission. You just need the courage to do it alone if that's what it takes." The journalist asked one more question. "Do you remember that meeting at Warner Brothers? When they told you actors don't decide?" Clint smiled. "Just slightly. I remember walking out. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed?" "No," Clint said. "Because I didn't stay." Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The script Warner Brothers rejected became one of the most celebrated westerns ever made. It sits now in the Academy Film Archive, preserved as a piece of American cinema history. On the cover page, in Clint's handwriting, there's a single note he added years later. They said actors don't decide. I decided anyway. That boardroom where 7 executives told him no is still there at Warner Brothers. It's been renovated twice. Different carpet. Different chairs. Different executives making different decisions about different films. But the people who were in that room in 1976 never forgot the day Clint Eastwood stood up and walked out without saying a word. Because the loudest statement he ever made was the one he didn't speak. He just left. And then he proved them wrong. For 40 years.